Coming off the sheer adrenaline-fueled high of escaping an exploding island on a jet ski in Resident Evil 4, you would expect Capcom to immediately start developing the next massive blockbuster sequel. Instead, the franchise gave us absolute whiplash. They hit the brakes, took a massive step backwards, and dropped us right back into the Spencer Mansion in 1996. Only this time, it was on a dual-screen Nintendo handheld. For a long time, Capcom had this bizarre, stubborn obsession with trying to force their flagship survival horror experience into your pocket, and the results were historically disastrous. The Handheld Curse was very real. If you look back at the late 90s, they genuinely tried to cram the entirety of the original Resident Evil onto a Game Boy Color cartridge. It was a wildly ambitious project, and the leaked prototype ROMs that still float around on the internet are fascinating pieces of gaming history, but the hardware just couldn't handle it. The pre-rendered backgrounds looked like a compressed, muddy mess, and the tank controls were basically unplayable on a tiny D-pad with only 2 face buttons. Capcom rightfully pulled the plug and cancelled it right before release. Their backup plan was Resident Evil Garden, an awkward, non-canon Game Boy Color spin-off that put Barry Burton and Leon Kennedy on a zombie-infested cruise ship. Instead of a traditional survival horror, the combat was reduced to this bizarre golf swing timing minigame where the slider moved rapidly back and forth across the screen whenever an enemy got close. It was a complete misfire that left a sour taste in everyone's mouth. For years, it genuinely felt like the series was strictly bound to home consoles. You just couldn't replicate that suffocating cinematic dread on a tiny portable screen, but in early 2006, Capcom decided to try one last time to get it right. They bundled up the exact game that started it all, stamped Resident Evil Deadly Silence on the box, and finally broke the curse. Booting up a Nintendo DS in 2006 and seeing that iconic, incredibly cheesy live-action intro sequence play out on a tiny top screen was a surreal experience. Even with the heavy video compression, it was undeniable proof that Capcom hadn't compromised. When you hit start and heard that legendary booming voice yell Resident Evil, you knew exactly what you were holding. This wasn't some watered down 2D remake trying to capture the spirit of the game, nor was it a clunky text adventure. This was a flawless, one-to-one transition of the 1996 PlayStation Classic, running seamlessly in the palm of your hand. The pre-rendered backgrounds of the Spencer Mansion were entirely intact and looked surprisingly sharp on the smaller display. In fact, because the DS hardware didn't suffer from that notorious PS1 polygon warping, the 3D models of Jill, Chris and the zombies actually looked a bit cleaner and more stable than we remembered them. It's hard to overstate what a technical marvel this felt like at the time. After suffering through the cancelled Game Boy Color port and the absolute weirdness of the cruise ship spin-off, finally being able to navigate the dining room, push the armoured statues, and get completely jump scared by the zombie dogs crashing through the window, all while sitting on the bus, was mind-blowing. Capcom finally cracked the code on portable survival horror. They proved that you didn't need to sacrifice the cinematic angles or the claustrophobic atmosphere just because the screen was smaller. They just gave us the exact game we fell in love with a decade prior, and then they made it even better.
Rebecca! Rebecca!
Chris!
Thank God you're safe.
I'm sorry that you were worried about me.
We are in great danger. We must organize a search for the others and get the hell out of here. Understood?
Yes, sir!
The original 1996 release is a masterpiece, but nobody is going to argue that it respects your time. The entire game was built around slow, deliberate pacing. The absolute biggest hurdle to replaying the PS1 classic is having to sift through those unskippable, agonisingly slow door loading screens every time you need to backtrack for a crest or a medallion. They were fantastic for building tension on your first playthrough, but by the time you are doing your 5th run just trying to unlock the infinite rocket launcher, you just want to get through the damn hallway. Deadly Silence completely fixed that. For the very first time, Capcom gave us the holy grail of classic survival horror, the ability to press a button and instantly skip the door animations. You could also skip the cutscenes. That alone justified the price of the cartridge, but they didn't stop there. They looked at the decades of mechanical evolution the franchise had gone through and retroactively injected it into the Spencer Mansion. Suddenly, Chris and Jill had the 180-degree quick turn that was introduced in the 3rd game. You could do tactical reloads without having to awkwardly pause the game and open your inventory screen. They even carried over the dedicated knife button from Resident Evil 4, meaning that completely useless combat knife finally didn't have to take up a precious inventory slot just to slice a zombie's ankles. These small, surgical quality of life updates completely shattered the original pacing of the game, and I mean that in the best way possible. By stripping all the artificial padding and modernising the controls, Deadly Silence transformed a grueling, methodical survival horror experience into an incredibly breezy, fast-paced arcade blast. You could comfortably sit down, relax and tear through the entire game in about 40 to 60 minutes. It turned a heavy, stressful classic into the ultimate, highly replayable pocket-sized comfort game that you could easily knock out on a daily commute. While the classic mode was the perfect nostalgia trip for the purists, Capcom couldn't just release a Nintendo DS game in 2006 without aggressively utilising the hardware. That is where Rebirth Mode comes in, and it is entirely responsible for some of the most bizarre design choices in the history of the franchise. Instead of just giving you a standard playthrough with more enemies or rearranging item placements, Rebirth Mode completely altered the pacing by injecting mandatory first-person touchscreen battles. You would be walking down a familiar pre-rendered hallway, and suddenly, the camera would abruptly snap into the first-person mode. A zombie, or worse, a hunter, would lunge directly at the screen, and you had to frantically pull out the stylus and aggressively slash the bottom of the display to fight them off. It basically turned the Spencer Mansion into a wildly out-of-place, violent game of Fruit Ninja. It completely broke the tension. It was so inherently goofy that you couldn't help but laugh at the sheer panic of scrambling for your plastic pen before the dog ripped your throat out. But that stylus wasn't even the weirdest part. Capcom also decided the microphone needed to be fully integrated into the survival horror experience. There were puzzles where you literally had to blow air into the console to clear dust off a book to reveal a hidden code. The absolute peak of this forced hardware integration happened when you found Richard Aiken dying of poison from the giant yawn. In the original game, you just rush across the mansion and get the serum. In Rebirth Mode, you actually had to lean over and rhythmically blow into the DS microphone to give the man CPR. Trying to explain to someone on the bus why you are intensely blowing air into your Nintendo to save a fictional SWAT team member is an experience completely unique to this specific port. It was peak early DS gimmickry, and while it completely shattered the horrific atmosphere of 1996, it gave this version a totally unique, deeply weird charm. Survival horror is, by its very nature, an isolating experience. The whole point of the Spencer Mansion is that you are trapped alone in a sprawling, hostile environment with heavily limited resources. So the idea of taking that meticulously crafted haunted house and turning it into a 4-player local wireless arena is completely unhinged. But for some reason, Capcom actually went ahead and built a full multiplayer suite right into Deadly Silence. If you managed to find 3 other people in 2006 who actually owned a Nintendo DS and a copy of the game, you could link up and drop into the mansion together. They offered 2 distinct ways to play. A cooperative mode where you work together to clear the rooms, solve puzzles and share health, and a much more chaotic competitive mode. The competitive side was basically an arcade score attack. You were actively racing against your friends through the iconic pre-rendered hallways, blasting zombies and hunters to rack up combo points, while hunting down specific coloured stars to trigger the stage exit. It was incredibly jarring to be carefully creeping through the infamous L-shaped hallway, only to see a bright pink palette swap version of Barry Burton sprint past you, shotgun a zombie in the face, and completely steal your points. It completely shattered any lingering tension the game had left. The claustrophobic dread of 1996 was replaced by pure, janky arcade chaos. Was it a highly refined, perfectly balanced multiplayer masterpiece? Absolutely not. It was clunky and bizarre, but it was also surprisingly addictive. It remains one of the most obscure, forgotten pieces of Resident Evil history, standing as a weird little experiment locked entirely on the Nintendo DS hardware.
Jill, here's my radio. You should keep it. I'm...
No! Richard!
Jill, be careful.
At the end of the day, Deadly Silence was an incredibly weird, surprisingly robust victory lap for the game that started it all. It didn't push the overarching narrative forward for the redefined third-person shooter genre like Resident Evil 4 had just done. Instead, it was a pure, concentrated dose of nostalgia, perfectly engineered for your pocket. After the absolute, exhausting massive scale of the Granados and the exploding islands, coming back to the quiet, familiar hallways of the Spencer Mansion was exactly what we needed. Having the ability to carefully skip those agonising door loading screens made it the ultimate palate cleanser. It proved that Capcom could finally do handheld horror right, delivering a fast, breezy 60-minute arcade run that still retained the exact soul of the 1996 classic without bogging you down in the slow, methodical dread. Make sure you hit subscribe and drop a comment below if you ever actually managed to wrangle 3 friends for that chaotic DS multiplayer, and hit the like button before you blow into your microphone one last time. Next time, we are trading the dual screens for modern controls. We are heading over to the Nintendo Wii to revisit the entire history of the franchise through a completely different perspective. An on-rails arcade-like gun shooter. Get your Wii Zapper ready for Resident Evil: The Umbrella Chronicles.
Here and now.
Don't scare me.
That's what I was going to say.